I don't think I have to do a lot of work to get you to understand or to appreciate the kind of underlying thesis behind the title of my program talk, that American politics is screwed up, whether it's alt-right people marching in Charlottesville or Antifa people who dress up in black and commit acts of political violence to fight fascism. I think we all have a sense that our politics is too boisterous, too loud, too combative, too negative. It's bitterly partisan, unable to get things done. Here's a way to graphically represent that. What you're looking at is from the good people at Pew Research is a chart of ideological distribution of our two political parties. So if you look at the ones, 1994 and 2004, surely the Republicans are on the right, Democrats are on the left, but they're actually quite close to each other, and there's quite a lot of overlap ideologically between the two parties. Then you look at 2017, and what we see is the literal polarization of the American public. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this is the case. In fact, we've heard some of those reasons today, but I'm going to talk about one political reason that might be counterintuitive. Our politics is bitterly partisan, not because our parties are too strong, but because our parties are too weak. Interest groups and money have too much power in our politics, not because we regulate them too little, but that we regulate them too much. Now, to tell this story, I have to kind of give you a history of American political parties. So let's start at the beginning. If you would have gone back to the American founding, a lot of our founders, like George Washington, were skeptical of political parties. In his famous farewell address, Washington says, "Beware the spirit of party." Well, why? I'll give you an example. I'm originally from the state of Minnesota, which means because of that reason and because I'm a masochist, I'm a big fan of the Minnesota Vikings. And so when Brett Favre was playing for the hated Green Bay Packers, we said, "We hate you, Brett Favre. You're the worst. We want you to lose every game and maybe get injured a little bit." But then what happened? He put on the purple number 4. "We love you, Brett Favre. You're the best. Win every game. Eternal health." And this is what Washington meant. Joining a political party is sort of like joining a sports team. It's irrational. Do I root for it because it's good or because it's mine? And now my loyalties are split. Am I rooting for this thing politically because it's good for the country or because it's good for the political party? So political parties are bad, so naturally the first thing we do is we form political parties. The first political party system organizes around the personality of Thomas Jefferson. They go by many names. Eventually they become the modern Democratic Party, so I'm going to call them the Democrats. The other party forms around the noted hip-hop artist Alexander Hamilton. They call themselves the Federalists. And if you think our politics are bitter, you're probably aware that in 1803, Thomas Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, shot and killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. And you could say with the death of Hamilton, that was the death of the Federalist Party. Within a decade or so, the Federalists ceased to be an important force in American politics. And so by the 19-teens, we essentially have one-party politics. Everything's a Democratic Party. And when you have one-party politics, it's like you have no-party politics. The divisions have to occur based on something else. And so what we start to see is in order to make an appeal to the people, you can't say what party I am because there's only one party. People have to start making extreme appeals, like making all sorts of crazy promises that you know you're never going to be able to actually fulfill, or maybe find the unpopular minority in the community and start attacking them so the majority will be on your side. Maybe this sounds familiar to you. And this sort of comes to a head in the 1824 election. In the 1824 election for president, there were not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 credible candidates for president. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford, who had been Secretary of Treasury and War in previous administrations. Well, because there were 4 credible candidates, they divided the vote 4 ways, and no one got a majority of the Electoral College, and so by the Constitution, the election went to the House of Representatives. Well, John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay had one thing in common. They hated Andrew Jackson. So in what the Jacksonians would end up calling the corrupt bargain, Adams went to Clay and said, "Clay, you throw your support behind me in the House. I'll become president of the United States. I'll choose you as my Secretary of State," which back then was like saying, "You're my successor." And will ace out that no-good Andrew Jackson. And that's how John Quincy Adams became the 6th President of the United States. Now, he got his comeuppance 4 years later when mano a mano between Jackson and John Quincy Adams, Jackson beat him like a drum. That's how Andrew Jackson became the 7th President of the United States. And Jackson had this key political operative from the state of New York. He had been governor of New York. He would end up being Jackson's 2nd vice president and eventually the 8th president of the United States. You know who I'm talking about, Martin Van Buren. That's a nice hairstyle. And Van Buren started looking at the politics of the 1820s, 1830s, and said, the problem of our politics is that we don't have strong political parties. What we need is 2, and only 2 political parties. And what Van Buren started to theorize is what 100 years later, a little over 100 years later, there's a political scientist named Anthony Downs. You don't need to remember that. There's no quiz. And he wrote a book called An Economic Theory of Democracy. And what Downs theorized and what Van Buren theorized, without the cool chart, you might remember this. This is a normal curve, giving you nightmares from high school math class. And what they both theorize is that political opinions are distributed normally, so therefore most people are in the middle. And if you have 2 and only 2 political parties, the parties will have an incentive to run towards the middle because that's where most people are. And this creates moderation and helps us avoid extremism. The other thing is we tend to think Republicans think this, Democrats think that, but that's not really true, is it? There are more progressive and more moderate Democrats. There are more moderate and more conservative Republicans. Really what you need to do in this system in order to be competitive is you need to form a big, broad-based coalition party. You need to show people who have superficial differences that they have enough in common that they should join together for a common cause. Think of Franklin Roosevelt and the famous New Deal coalition of the 1930s, where he showed urban laborers, rural farmers, and racial minorities that despite their differences, they had enough in common that they should join the Democratic Party, and they did, right? And so what we started creating in the 1830s is what I call the party system, right? A system of very strong political parties. And this system brought us good things. I've already talked about moderation, the avoidance of political extremism. A government based on coalitions of parties who are big coalitions, which means there's moderation within the parties. We get more effective government because when you think about it, most electoral offices in the United States are legislative offices. Look at the U.S. Congress. There are 535 House and Senate members of Congress, but only 1 president. Well, what is the job of a legislator? A job of a legislator is to take people with superficial differences, show them that they have enough in common to join a coalition in order to pass a piece of legislation. Look, what is successful electorally is tied to what is successful in government. So we're promoting the kinds of skills that make for good legislation. We also get an institutional check and ambition. I'm not running for office saying, here's what I'm going to do for you. It's what my party is going to do for you. And I'm only successful if my party is successful, if I'm adding to my party's coalition and showing that I'm a good party soldier. And if I start to get a little bit too extreme, and I start detracting from that coalition instead of adding to it, the party has the power to get rid of me and find someone more moderate who will add to their coalition. And finally, you get legitimacy. No more problems of 1824. When there are 2 and only 2 people running for office, it's relatively easy to see who wins, and that person will, by definition, have a majority of the vote. And this is good because then even the people who lose the election can accept that result as legitimate because it makes sense. Well, there are problems with this party system, though. I've kind of painted a rosy picture. A lot of the power in the party system was by unelected party leaders. I wouldn't call that an undemocratic system, but it's probably less democratic than we'd like. A lot of those decisions made in the proverbial smoke-filled room behind closed doors. And that's a less open system than we would like. When you get less open and less democratic, that equals more corrupt, right? And the party system was defined by corruption. And for that reason, and because of the rise of industrialization, in the late 19th, early 20th century, a lot of people start thinking that we need big policy changes. We need things like minimum wage law, workplace safety laws, child labor laws. Maybe there should be a legal work week. And this party system that is both corrupt, but also what I'm painting as a virtue, it's moderation, they paint it as a vice. It's too slow to change. They won't accept these radical policy changes that we want. And so in the early 20th century, the progressive movement started saying, we need political reforms. In order to get our policy reforms, we need political reforms. Things like the secret ballot, things like direct election of senators, women's suffrage. What I think is the biggest one of these is primary elections. No longer will party leaders control who runs under the party label, the party brand. It'll be up to voters in a broad-based election. And this is the system that we live in now, and it has a lot of benefits. In fact, those benefits basically mirror the problems of the party system. That was less democratic than we like. We have a more democratic system. How do we choose our nominees, like for president? Well, we have these primary elections, and people go out and vote. We just did this in South Dakota a few weeks ago for various offices. Right? That's a more democratic system. Our political conventions are out in the open. If you want to watch a national convention, it's gavel to gavel on C-SPAN. You can see the whole thing. And more democratic, more open equals less corrupt. Yes, our system is less overtly corrupt than that 19th, early 20th century party system. The corruption of the reformed system is of a different kind. And this is the system that we live in today, kind of reaching its head. It evolves over time, kind of reaching its full maturity in the 1960s, 1970s. And this reform system has problems. What are these problems? One of them is what we call personality-based politics, because the party label doesn't mean as much as it used to. And we're not voting based on party. What we often vote on is based on personality, which, for example, gives rise to celebrity candidates like Donald Trump, Oprah Winfrey, maybe. I just read this morning, Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, thinking about running for president. Well, these people get promoted in this system because they come in with a ready-built brand that everybody knows. And they don't have to buy it or convince you of it. You already know it. Or this is an incentive for very wealthy candidates, because they can very easily use their own money to purchase that brand and get that name recognition. The problem of this is that these candidates are usually amateurs. And so if they actually get into office, they don't really have the skills oftentimes to do the things that legislators or executives have to do. The other problem with this system is it's an encouragement to demagoguery. In order for get you to pay attention to me, I have to say extreme things, maybe attack that unpopular minority. Another problem of this system is what we call candidate-centered elections. Because of our campaign finance laws, candidates are basically left on their own to create their own organization, hire their own staffs, run their own media, raise their own money. And it is illegal in most cases for them to ask for party help. So what does that mean? All right. What that means is we get extremely long campaign seasons, right? Because they've got to do it all on their own. And this takes time to create an organization out of nothing and to raise the kind of money that it takes to run for political office. And so our federal candidates are normally announcing for office 1.5 to 2 years before the actual election, and this gives us election fatigue. The other problem of this is that this is the central thing that gives rise to the power of interest groups. Because I'm limited with our campaign finance system how much money I can give to a candidate or a party, but because of First Amendment reasons, I'm unlimited in what I can give to interest groups. Instead of money flowing to parties and candidates who are accountable to the people, the money flows to interest groups who are unaccountable to the people and almost by definition are more extreme in single interest. So if you're on the right and you don't like the National Education Association, their dominance of the Democratic Party, and they get in the way of needed educational reforms, or you're on the left and you don't like the National Rifle Association because they have too much control over the Republican Party and get in the way of needed gun regulations, your problem is with our electoral system, which rewards this kind of activity because the money is flowing to them and the candidates are dependent on that independent outside money because it's so hard for them to raise it themselves and to coordinate with the party. And the final problem with this system is what we call the permanent campaign. Even longtime incumbents, because they are completely on their own, are anxious about re-election. Therefore, they're always trying to appeal to donors. They're always trying to appeal to activists. They're always engaging in rhetoric to try to attract the attention and capture the people. And so our governing rhetoric ends up looking a lot like our electoral rhetoric. And this is a problem because electoral rhetoric thrives on distinctions. This is why I'm awesome and why my opponent stinks. But as I've suggested, our governing rhetoric has to be based on conciliation. So much of the rhetoric in government today is not really governing rhetoric. It is designed to be extremist, and the goal is not to convince people who disagree with me, but to convince the people who do agree with me so they can get activated and that they will give me money. And whatever you think of Mark Zuckerberg, when he was in front of Congress a few weeks ago, that was a show trial. There was no interest in actually gaining information from him that might lead to better legislation that would maybe, for example, protect internet privacy better. That was a show trial for members of the House and Senate to grandstand in front of a camera so they could show how much they dislike an unpopular political figure like Mark Zuckerberg, who's easy to beat up on. And that was a campaign event. It was not a governing event. So what are the possible solutions to this problem? Right? One is that, again, contrary to what we think, we probably need to make it easier, not harder, for our candidates to raise money. When Eugene McCarthy ran for president in 1968 and ended up driving Lyndon Johnson out of the race, he had 5 donors. 5. Because they could give unlimited money to him. And that money went to a candidate who was accountable. Nowadays, that would go to an interest group that's unaccountable. We need to make it easier for candidates to raise money and to coordinate with their political parties. I think that from top to bottom, we should probably do what the Democrats do for presidential elections. At their convention, they have these delegates called superdelegates. They're party leaders who are selected because of that leadership position, not because they're elected out of a primary. And party leaders are more likely to have that sensitive touch to the party coalition and to avoid more extreme candidates, unlike the rank and file who are more likely to be influenced by demagoguery. But the final solution is you and me. We have to support candidates who are more moderate in their rhetoric and are willing to compromise. We have to be willing to question our own prejudices. Just because somebody says something that strokes my prejudices or says something that I disagree with, we automatically reject them. Or if this candidate says one thing I disagree with, he's out because I need to have someone who's pure. And so we need to support candidates who are conciliatory and moderate in their rhetoric, not combative and angry in their rhetoric. And I think if we do this, our politics will be a little bit less screwed up. Thank you.